as you can see, I spend a lot of my life chasing some quite dubious people. The trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. 40% just in the trade in weapons. And these are the people who I've spent the last 16 years trying to write about. But the reason I'm so pleased to be here at the invitation of the Daily Maverick is because I believe the Daily Maverick and their partners are playing an absolutely crucial role in exposing the nature of the corruption of our state and trying to ensure the maintenance of our democratic and constitutional values. And from the perspective that I have living in London and traveling the world, speaking about issues of corruption and the arms trade, I can say with a degree of certainty that South Africa stands tall in the arena of investigative journalism globally. Together with the judiciary, a very active and forthright civil society, journalists are the bulwark against the corrosive effects of corruption on our democracy. But the tragedy, in my opinion, of the democratic South Africa is not that we're worse than anyone else. The tragedy is the speed and enthusiasm with which, after 1994, we adopted the very tawdry global norms of politics. This was seen primarily, but not exclusively, as a consequence of the ill-fated arms deal that you saw briefly in that clip. But it reflects a far broader problem in the world. You know, Barack Obama, when he was first standing for president, lamented the smallness of our politics in contrast to the enormity of our challenges. And sadly, with the Obama presidency gone, nothing has changed. From my vantage point, I believe that representative democracy, where we are lucky enough to live in democracies, is in crisis. Donald Trump, whose lack of personal morals and ethics on issues ranging from gender and race to the payment of taxes and pretty much everything in between, runs an administration by tweet that is overseeing the beginnings of the collapse of the American state. A dramatic rise in intolerance, misogyny, and racism. The incitement of conflict around the world on a potentially terrifying scale. And all the while, he is using the White House to enrich himself, his business associates, and his family. He and his family's straight-faced, continual lying is undermining the very nature of American democracy and testing to the limits whether the system's checks and balances will hold. I hope to many of you that that story sounds familiar. In Britain, where I live, a mediocre government lurches from one disaster to the next, while real wages continue to decline, inequality continues to rise. But the head of state, the Queen, and the heir to the throne, Prince Charles, as well as numerous senior politicians, secrete money offshore to reduce their tax bills. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, called an election a few months ago to increase her majority, after a campaign in which she refused to debate her opponents and engaged only with hand-picked party activists, doing everything she could to avoid the general public, the people she is supposed to be leading. Not only did she lose her majority, but she effectively bribed a small, racist, homophobic party in Northern Ireland to the tune of £1 billion to keep herself in office. Amidst these stagnating wages and increasing inequality, the use of offshore jurisdictions to launder ill-gotten money and to reduce tax payable to the state is on the rise. Whatever the legality of the schemes exposed in the Panama and now the Paradise Papers, what we do know is that this behavior deprives the fiscus of desperately needed resources with which to help those in need, with which to provide services and support to enable as many people as possible to survive and prosper. The UK-based National Bureau of Economic Research found in a study just a couple of months ago that 10% of global GDP is today held in tax havens offshore. 80% of that offshore wealth is owned by just 0.1% of the world's people. In 2012, the Tax Justice Network found that between $21 and $32 trillion is held offshore by these people. That means $400 to $600 billion annually of tax that is not paid. And when it comes to Africa, the economist Gabriel Zucman estimates that as much as 30% of the continent's wealth is held offshore. It would be fascinating to know how much of that offshore wealth belongs to the continent's kleptocrats, including the recently departed Robert Mugabe and the first shopper. But when you realize the extent to which these activities are taking place by the people who are supposed to be leading our nations, it comes as no surprise that underpinning the current state of the world is systemic corruption on a truly gargantuan scale. Between $1 trillion and $2.6 trillion is paid annually in bribes, costing the equivalent of 2% of global GDP in lost economic activity. And this is according to the IMF. In 2013, the African Union estimated that $184 billion is lost in Africa every year to corruption. That's equal to about 25% of the continent's GDP. And in case there are still people in the world who think that corruption is a victimless crime, it is worth mentioning that a study by PwC found that corruption in the procurement of public goods increases the costs on average by 13% on each project as a consequence of corruption. To put it in more human terms, we should never forget those who lost their lives in the Gauteng mental health fiasco. Nor should we forget the 365,000 South Africans who, according to a study by the School of Public Health at Harvard, lost their lives as a consequence of South Africa's decision to spend $10 billion on weapons and not provide antiretroviral medication to those people living with HIV and AIDS who could not afford the medication. And it's worth bearing in mind that most of those weapons we never really needed. That a significant percentage of those weapons have never been used. As we correctly admonish ourselves for allowing this theft of the public's resources, let's also bear in mind that the British company that, according to British police, paid £115 million in bribes to win one contract on our arms deal, was at the same time paying similar bribes in 7 other countries around the world, begging the important question of who is more corrupt, the recipients or the global corruptors. And it's not just the bribe-paying companies, often with the support of their governments from these wealthier countries, who need to be stopped. It is also the financial institutions, legal, accounting, and advisory firms who facilitate and enable this corruption. The names of the odious Bell Pottinger, KPMG, HSBC, McKinsey, and others come to mind in South Africa. Without these facilitators, the tiny political and economic elite that corrupts the world would be unable to do so. But the stark truth that we must never forget is that countries like South Africa, as a consequence of our socio-economic realities, can afford this corruption even less than the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, China, or the United States, where so many of the corruptors are based and protected. Our people, especially the poorest, require an efficient, honest, and accountable government that meets their basic needs. The ANC of Jacob Zuma and the many in the party who keep him in office, enabling his pillage of the state, could not be further from this ideal. The organization is unrecognizable to me from the ANC I identified with in the 1980s and served as an MP in the mid-1990s. It is unrecognizable from the organization of Nelson Mandela. The roots of the current state of the ANC and our country were laid with the arms deal, were laid with the willingness to undermine our democracy, to protect one's political allies from investigation, while using corruption inquiries only to threaten one's opponents. And that led to the elision of the state and the party, and the primacy in the party of loyalty over ability. But the reality is that the current nuclear deal that the president seems so determined to push through at any cost will make the arms deal seem like small change, both in the scale of its corruption and its corrosive impact on our democracy. If one was thinking of the power needs of our country, if one was concerned about corruption, the last two people on the planet one would want negotiating such a deal are Messrs. Vladimir Putin and Jacob Zuma. Who on earth would want to spend $1 trillion or $1.5 trillion getting Russia to build and run nuclear power stations? Have we forgotten the nuclear catastrophe of Chernobyl? Is that what we want to meet our power needs? No. Just like the arms deal, it's what we want to meet our patronage and corruption needs. This deal reflects the catastrophic extent to which the party and state have become primarily a means for self-enrichment and personal aggrandizement, especially while the prosecuting services and some other oversight entities contort their spineless bodies to pretend blissful ignorance that ensures impunity for the looters of the state. Those who have participated in or enabled this looting have betrayed our democracy and all those who fought so valiantly for its birth and initial growth. And let us, for a moment, remember the words and actions of our first democratically elected president, through which he constantly reminded us that elected representatives and officials are there to serve the people, who, after all, pay their salaries. And the single most important job of these representatives is to safeguard the public's money that is given to the state in the form of taxes to enhance the common good, and to spend that money wisely and in the best interests of all. To misspend or misappropriate that money is theft. It is, in fact, the worst theft of all, as it is the betrayal of the privilege and honor of serving the people of this extraordinary country. This base, egregious theft should result in removal from office, criminal trial, and imprisonment. In addition, it should be treated with contempt by all South Africans. Those who disrespect our democracy and our constitution, be they the president or anybody else, should be disrespected by the nation as a whole. And it should start next month, when the ruling party have the final opportunity to show the country that they favor the nation over the greed of party leaders, the constitution over the corrupt machinations of the state, the people over patronage. Václav Havel, a Czech dissident who led the Velvet Revolution and became president of Czechoslovakia, after 6 months in office said, "Politics requires the most moral of people, but too often attracts exactly the opposite. We must ensure that the nation has the politicians it deserves, representatives who will serve the people, not steal from them. Anything less will ensure that South Africa continues to become less democratic, even more corrupt, and less able to serve the people in whose name our democracy was won." Thank you very much.
Come sit here, a little bit closer to me.
Where do you want me?
As long as you don't get that sniper thing on your head, that red thing. It's kind of... Andrew, we were chatting a little bit earlier on about your loss of innocence as an activist, as an ANC member, as a person who was part of the struggle, realizing what the arms deal meant. But then our conversation went to looking at the arms deal has been part of causing chaos in the world from before 1914, First World War, Second World War, and at other times. And political currents, global political currents change, yet the arms industry, Britain exports more arms today than anything else, I think. It used to export cotton and cars. Now it sells us arms.
Its biggest manufacturing export is weapons.
Absolutely. And then the interesting thing is that there are fewer wars in the world, but more guns in circulation, and then those guns, it's absurd. It seems like sort of a Ponzi scheme of some sort. But coupled with this, we have then in the late 1980s, the collapse of communism and capitalism as competing ideologies. And what we seem to have now is a kind of voracious predatory capitalism which has co-opted elites and the rich of the world, putting the money offshore.
Absolutely.
And it's happening... So we're on the threshold of something new. We've spoken about what is it, and how do we return power to people? Because politicians, when they speak, we don't believe them anymore. In fact, they took up 10 minutes of our time. And we were kind of like, Speak to that phenomenon, and Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders and the kinds of politicians we're looking at saving us.
I think the first thing to say is just to reiterate the point that contrary to what we might read in the media, contrary to what we might see in Hollywood films and on our television screens, the world is actually more peaceful than it's been at any time in human history. But we sell more weapons than we ever have. Why is that? It's because a very small elite, what Lawrence Wilkerson in the film describes as the national security elite, consisting of politicians, senior generals, 84% of whom, by the way, in the United States, when they leave the Pentagon, go into the employment at ridiculously high salaries of the very companies to whom they've been giving contracts through their military careers. Intelligence agents, corporate executives, and of course, the intermediaries, the arms dealers. Terrible thing about showing that film in townships, which we hope to do again next year around the country, was that quite a lot of the kids who came into the screenings in Lange, Khayelitsha, and in Alex thought that I was that rather large arms dealer. Which made me want to get onto the R1 million worth of bicycles that was being spoken about. But the reality that this is a trade that is effectively manufactured through a fear industry. An academic, James Dederian, talks about the military-industrial entertainment complex. And the reason I'm so fascinated by the arms trade is nothing to do with the weapons. It's to do with the corruption. It's to do with the fact that the politicians, business executives, and the intermediaries do things in the arms trade, all of which is secret, behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy, that they wouldn't dare do in other trades, even corrupt other trades like oil or construction. They do what they really want to do. And they hide their criminal activities behind this secrecy.
But this was the case in the apartheid government as well. It's almost just a system remained in place and was just sort of taken over by another
the
group
apartheid
of
government
people.
was worse in two obvious respects. One, obviously, because it was a legalized racist state. Yeah. But second of all, because the corruption was so inherently systemic. So a massive proportion of the budget during the apartheid years was off the books. Parliament didn't even get to see it, in order to buy oil, arms, etc.
A bit like now, actually.
Absolutely. And, for anyone who wants to understand that, I cannot recommend highly enough Henny van Vuren's new book, Apartheid, Guns and Money, which lays that whole thing bare, and how our arms deal was just an elision from the apartheid era. But this is what is happening globally, as you say. There is this tiny elite of corporate leaders and political leaders for whom the world is working brilliantly, and who control such an obscene amount of money. I don't know what they want to do with this money. When I wrote the book first in 2011, Vladimir Putin was worth over $40 billion. Is now probably worth over $60 billion. What does he need that sort of money for? It's almost as though it's part of his ego and his identity.
We also spoke about how money has become incredibly abstract. And in this instance, I forgive our president for not being able to say 21, 11, 11, 11, 11, 11. Because how many of us here can imagine $1 trillion?
I mean, it's completely absurd. It's completely absurd. The reason our president couldn't get the figures right is because even at corruption, he's bloody useless. On the arms deal, Jacob Zuma took R500,000, which in the context of global corruption is pitiful.
Well, our Uber driver last night said, I'd rather be ripped off by Putin than by a fool, which I thought was a terrible thing to say.
I mean...
So what
we find ourselves in something of an interregnum between an existing paradigm of neoliberal economics, which effectively said that greed is good, and if anybody just followed their greediest instincts, the world would all be right. And there were these massive theories to justify this, and it's an absolute nonsense. And we start the film with that because that's what allowed the sort of unregulated, out-of-control,
unfettered,
corrupt global arms trade. We don't know what we are going to. We're seeing the signs that the vast majority of people are starting to say, no, stuff this. I can see how it's working for that 1%, but it sure ain't working for me. It reminded me during Obama's presidency, he announced great employment figures, as Donald Trump seems to tweet about on a daily basis without any reference to the actual figures. And a woman responded, brilliant woman who was caught by a news camera, saying, President Obama, thank you so much for all of these jobs you've created. I hold 3 of them. Because it takes an ordinary person 3 jobs to be able to survive. We're now talking about poverty in work in the United Kingdom.
So the corset economy, where you have a small elite at the top who are siphoning off the tax, that you see in the Paradise Papers, depriving countries of that tax in order to service. You have a middle class being squeezed, and then you have people dying of hunger at the bottom of it all. Is there a possibility, there are places, and I know there's a film called The Accidental Anarchist, which I've been watching, about where direct democracy has worked in other spaces in the world. Small experiments where you remove from the elites and the politicians in a post-ideological age, where there is no ideology, and say, I have the money and the tax, I'm withdrawing it from the system. Cryptocurrency, bartering, I know it sounds to many ridiculous, but we have to somehow prevent these elites and these voracious private companies from robbing the electorates.
There are 2 things. The first is that we're already seeing the outrage. Bernie Sanders in the United States of America, who was a fairly peripheral senator from Vermont, ran in the primary of a political party of which he wasn't even a member and garnered 13 million votes. Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom, who is actually by background more of an anti-war activist than an MP, he rebelled in votes against his own party more than any other MP in British electoral history, became leader of the Labour Party, and won 40% of the vote in the last election, which was the biggest increase in vote gained by a political party in the United Kingdom since the election immediately after the Second World War. For 2 reasons. One, he's saying our system benefits the few, not the many. And 2, he's just an honest, authentic guy who says what he thinks, who can't be scripted and won't read sound bites. When we then take that to the realm of direct democracy, one of the experiments that I found most interesting was in Reykjavik in Iceland, which is obviously tiny. But after the financial collapse, they jailed bankers and politicians and threw out all their politicians. So they had, as mayor of Reykjavik, a performance artist who I saw pictures of. He had tattoos from the top of his bald head to the bottom of his feet. Not your obvious-looking politician. What is the first thing he did in this very wealthy, very tiny city? Is he ensured that everybody over the age of 18, so everybody who could vote, had access to a tablet device. And on every single vote on how money should be spent in that city, every single citizen could vote. So it wasn't about councillors voting what was important to them that they could make money out of. It was what the citizens felt was important.
That's happening. That happened to a certain extent in Catalonia before the war. And what you're seeing now is the security establishment in countries in Europe and Africa and everywhere else being used against citizens who are rebelling. So the security apparatus is no longer there to protect you from an outside enemy, it's to protect you from your own citizens.
It's not just in Africa. The biggest example of it is the United States of America,
absolutely.
where policing has become completely militarized, leading to the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement.
So then democracy has failed. We participate in this charade. These politicians arrive, lie to us, bullshit, talk. We know they're not, their lips move, but we can't hear what they're saying. They go away and do these deals in secrecy. They use auditing firms and consultants to siphon off money to have the kind of wealth that is unspeakable, while people die starving in Esidimeni, life in Esidimeni. What are we going to do?
Well, there's a huge amount that we can do, because at the moment, where we're lucky enough to live in democracies, we think that voting every 4 or 5 years is fine. That's our responsibility as citizens. We've got to bear in mind that the people we're electing are supposed to be serving us. Mandela used to say this to us in the ANC caucus all the time. They are not there to be important, to drive fancy cars, wear fancy clothes, and have their hair done every 2 days. They are there to serve us. Now, how many of you actually think that the vast majority of MPs in our parliament are serving you?
Well, I must say one thing to you. I have to say, having sat in on some of the SCOPA hearings, of which you were the chair at one point now, and some of the other parliamentary committees, I have really felt an enormous amount of excitement about the young people in this country, the politicians. I have to say that to you. I come away from a space thinking, even if it's young people in the EFF, definitely, IFP, DA, people really holding government to account in that space. Makosi Khosa is here as well. I come away from those spaces. I'm not sure what the end results will be of all of these.
But let's bear in mind that these are the exceptions, and they're incredibly courageous and important exceptions who deserve all of our credit and support. But the reality is every single representative and official should be like that.
All right, so what we can't take our money out of circulation because I don't understand cryptocurrency, but it's a way of doing it. We can't withhold our vote because then the populists and the right-wing bigots will vote.
Yeah.
What do we have left?
We do a number of things. We take to the streets, first of all. Let's not forget what we've done in this country. We have changed remarkable things. I had to leave this country in 1986 because I didn't want to serve in the apartheid army. I remember driving over Chapman's Peak Drive in Cape Town and thinking, I won't see this country again. Apartheid is not going to disappear in my lifetime. If somebody had said to me then, no, in 9 years' time, you'll be back in the country, the ANC will be in power, and Nelson Mandela will be your president, I would have recommended they get a straitjacket. Yeah. But the reality is that's what's happened. And the reality is we remain a highly politicized and a highly politically active country. And what we did as well, look at the Treatment Action Campaign. This is one of the world's most remarkable social movements that took our own democratically elected president, Thabo Mbeki's AIDS denialism, and fought him on the streets, fought him in the courts, and ultimately won. So that's what we need to focus on against this current government
we need
now.
To treasure. And those are the things you and I, who come from the past, understand. So when I walk into Parliament, when I am able to adopt my children, when I can marry my partner, these are freedoms we shouldn't allow to be removed. They are that I can.
But we have to fight for them.
We have to fight. I've realized that too, that you can't sit back and wait. The politicians stole 10 minutes of our time, so we've got 39 seconds left, but we're going to steal some of their time back. I do understand that some of you will want to ask questions. We can't take many. If there's any areas we've not gone into, I could speak to you for very much longer.
I'll be outside afterwards.
Outside, signing books, and it's not apocalypse any minute now. But so we do live in a post-ideological world. There is no sense of the betterment of humankind, of solidarity, of all of those.
We live in a world in which political and corporate leaders pursue their own interests, and at the moment have been getting away with it. And they do it in illegal and criminal ways even in terms of our own laws. But just like in the arms trade, they don't get prosecuted. They operate in a parallel legal universe to the rest of us.
They do. Okay, questions. Lights up. Let's have a look. I hate doing this pointing of who's you and you. Those two hands there. Any more questions? I wanted to say to Musi, if he wants more white people to march for the DA, he must just say he's going to nationalize Woolworths. We'll be there very quickly. Or the Mount Nelson, maybe.
The Mount Nelson.
Good day.
Good day.
Hi.
My name is Larato. My question is, how would one prevent being silenced when you want to expose such people? And which people should we go to for support? Because it's very hard to fight these big people when you're just this tiny person and no one is going to take you seriously because they feel like what you're saying to them is complete rubbish.
Yeah. First of all, I think the important thing to say is don't ever think of yourself as a small person. Because the reality is there was a brilliant American anthropologist whose father told her in the 1930s that there was no point her going to university. She needed to find a husband. And her way of responding to that politely, rather than giving him the finger, was to become the first woman to receive a doctorate at Harvard University. And she went on to become, still until today, even though she's no longer alive, one of the greatest anthropologists that ever lived. And she said, just before she died, she said, never forget that history is changed by the actions of small groups of thoughtful and committed citizens working together. So first of all, never think of yourself as small. Second of all, the most important thing, especially in the world we live in, is to ensure you have your facts straight. When I wrote this book about the global arms trade, there hadn't been a book on the trade for over 30 years because publishers were terrified about being sued by the arms companies, the arms dealers, the politicians. We had almost 3,000 footnotes in the book. Make sure you've got your facts correct. And then use everything you have. Use the power of people on the street. It's hugely embarrassing to people, especially in a country like South Africa. Use the courts. We have a largely remarkable judiciary in this country, and use the media. I believe that our investigative media in this country is amongst the best in the world, and it's certainly one of the biggest proportionally to the size of our country. If you look at the Gupta leaks, for instance, the way in which it is revealed, the sort of corruption that our senior-most political leaders are allowing and are engaged in, you find that in very few countries of the world today. So I think those things are worth bearing in mind. And then look at other things. For instance, you mentioned tax. There is a group of war veterans, former military service people in the United States of America, who, through a colleague of mine, calculated that for every dollar they pay in tax, 30 cents goes to the weapons-making companies. So they calculate their taxes, and they deduct 30% from them, and they put them in an account that they call a peace fund. And they pay the state the 70%, because paying tax is very important in having a decent society. But you withhold tax for the things that you find unacceptable. And I think if this continues in this country, we have to start thinking about things like that.
There was one other question. I'm not sure, Jethro, there you go, sir.
My name's Graham McIntosh. I used to be a colleague of Andrew's in Parliament, and we actually lived round the corner from each other, and startled him in a 7-Eleven when he was making a clandestine phone call. And he looked very guilty. But what interests me, Andrew, is why do you still live in London if you think South Africa is so good, and why don't you bring your children here to get educated?
For a number of reasons, the most important of which is very sadly, because I would far rather live in Cape Town than London, believe me, is that doing the work I do on global corruption and the global arms trade is extremely difficult to do from Cape Town. I spend around 300 days a year traveling. If I lived in Cape Town, that would be closer to 350 days a year. That's the first thing. Second of all, to engage around the global arms trade, I have to look beyond South Africa. The United States of America produces between 30 and 50% of all weapons produced in the world every year. To take on the US from South Africa is simply impossible. And the third reason is a more personal one, which is a very sad one for me. is that my children feel themselves to be Londoners, which is very difficult for me because I only feel at home when I land back in South Africa. But I think there will come a time, hopefully soon, when both of my children can fend for themselves, when I'll be able to spend far more time in this country again. I'll be back in February where there will be a tribunal, a people's tribunal around corruption, giving evidence about the arms deal. But I also think, and it's not an unimportant point, that as South Africans, we can learn a hell of a lot from the rest of the world because the problems we have are not unique. And I think having that exposure to how the global system works and how it impacts on South Africa is also not unimportant.
And the globe learned how we also work because we shut down Bell Pottinger. Thank you, South Africa.
That's
we got rid of Bell Pottinger.
Very true. Bell Pottinger.
Clap your hands for yourselves. We did it, people. We did it. We got rid of them.
Who, by the way, besides representing the Guptas, represented most of the world's worst dictators, including Augusto Pinochet, and most of the world's arms dealers.
And also interfered in elections in Malawi and Zambia.
Yeah.
So, but that's another story. Thank you very much, all of you, for your attention. Andrew, thank you very much. To the whistleblowers who are here, who come to us, also, that's something else. We cannot do this without you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. You are patriots. You are the ones who are helping us do this difficult job. Thank you very much.